PhD, journalist, celebrity historian, culture writer. How did a girl from Lewiston, Idaho grow up to become a voice of the millennial generation? Believe it or not, it started with gossip.
Even in junior high and high school, I was really obsessed with Entertainment Weekly, and we got it at the beginning of its run in the early 90s, and every week it would come on Wednesday, and I would read it like cover to cover.
Celebrity gossip meets history in Anne Helen Petersen's 2014 book, Scandals of Classic Hollywood.
So I hope you guys can see this mic. Getting fitted for this is maybe the highlight of my career, because while I study celebrity, I'm by no means a celebrity. So to have a Britney Spears mic on me right now is just awesome.
Every time I write a longer piece on BuzzFeed, like the first comment is like, wow, I can't believe this is on BuzzFeed. Like, this is really smart or whatever. And what I like is like, that's the last time that person can say that, because now they've been introduced essentially to the news section where we're doing that sort of thing all the time.
Celebrities weren't Petersen's only beat on BuzzFeed, but it did provide the subject for her next book.
Of course, there have been unruly women for as long as there have been boundaries of what constitutes acceptable feminine behavior. Women who, in some way, step outside the boundaries of good womanhood, who end up being labeled too fat, too loud, too slutty, to whatever characteristic women are supposed to keep under control.
In yet another viral BuzzFeed article, Petersen tackled the topic of millennial burnout.
Does this sound familiar? You crossed one thing off your to-do list only to add two more things to it.
If you said yes, you may be feeling a little burned out. And Anne Helen Petersen says you are not alone.
She wrote all about it in the viral BuzzFeed article it was called How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation.
The article turned into a book. Anne Helen Petersen writes what a generation feels and what needs to change.
So that the way things were, it wasn't working. The way we've organized work, the way we interact with technology, the way we conceive of parenting, the way we've turned all corners of our lives into an opportunity for productivity, it wasn't working.
On the other side of the screen tonight is Spokesman-Review reporter Arielle Dreher. We are so pleased to welcome Anne Helen Petersen to tonight's virtual Northwest Passages stage.
Welcome, viewers. We will not be talking about healthcare tonight, and you might appreciate the break. We would really, really appreciate you welcoming Anne Helen Petersen to join us tonight to talk about her new book, Can't Even. And I just want to apologize in advance, Anne Helen. I am not a video reporter. I'm a print reporter, just like you. So, keep the questions moving and flowing, but, just in advance.
Yeah, I'm banished to the basement, and you're trying to figure out your lighting. It's dark already. We are not on CNN. We are broadcasting to the Inland Empire. And
there we go. I appreciate that a lot. And if I look down, it's because I'm looking at questions from the viewers. So I promise I'm not being rude. But I do have a list of things that I can't wait to talk to you about. I gobbled this book up. I'm hoping, to start us out, that you can sort of give us the truncated version of what burnout is and sort of who we're talking about when we talk about millennials. And then we can maybe go from there, just to sort of give viewers a jumping off points, because there's so many things we can talk about, especially since a pandemic hit right when you were finishing your book. It sort of, I think, highlights almost everything that you wrote about. But if you want to start by giving viewers, a little intro to burnout, if you will.
Yeah. So, millennials technically are people who are born 1980, 1981 through 1995. And I think, though, that you can be a millennial in your heart. Like, if you entered into adulthood and kind of started looking for a job at the same time that millennials were, it doesn't really matter what age you were. And also, if the millennial condition is distinguished by precarity, by instability. So there are lots of people who can identify with that. And burnout, the way that I think about it, is that feeling of you've been running a race. You're like, I can't wait to be done with this race. I'm so exhausted. I can't go another step. You hit the wall, and instead of collapsing, you scale the wall and then you keep going again, right? So it's like not just running a marathon, it's running 1,700 marathons for the rest of your life until you die. And I think that it's slightly different than the World Health Organization definition of burnout, which, because it's the World Health Organization, it's easier for them to, I think, really limit their idea of burnout just to the workplace. They think of it as a very occupational hazard, like
Totally.
actually something that is only during work hours. And any American will tell you that there is no such thing as work that is limited to your work hours. So I think that my understanding of it and the way that I talk about it in the book is much more about like a holistic life experience.
Definitely, definitely. Well, so I guess I should explain to readers that don't know, I fall on this millennial scale. I was born in 1991. Anne Helen is what I would call an elder millennial, and we sort of like, we represent two ends of a spectrum. And so reading your book for me, like really felt like reading a history of what has been the backdrop of my 29 years. And what was interesting to me is the history, a little bit behind how systems that used to be in place to prop up the quote unquote middle class, which we can get into later, but systems that used to be in place and paid for largely by the government are almost entirely gone. And sort of the underlying notion that I found in your book that was like, again, resonated very strongly with me, and just when I was reading and thinking about my conversations with friends, like, wow, this system that we are all a part of is broken. And so I'm hoping, again, the short version, and people will have to read your book to get the long version. Very well researched, y'all. She is a journalist. I highly recommend it. But you know, if you can give the mini history tour, if you will, of sort of how we got here, because I think that's something that a lot of millennials, when they complain about burnout, and I think one of the things that your book really does well is give language to that. But older generations have said, well, you guys just need to suck it up. But the reality is, like, we are actually confronting an economy and a system that is not working for reasons. And so if you can give a little bit of that history, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So I think that the fundamental thing for us to understand, first of all, is that burnout is connected to precarity, to instability. And that means instability in your financial life, but also instability in all parts, like other parts of your life too. And a lot of that instability for millennials has to do with where we graduated into job seeking, right? So whether it was you graduated from high school or from college or from grad school, you graduated into a time that was either right before or right during or right after what we call the Great Recession, right?
Yep.
And so I think a lot of millennials, and so I have a kind of slightly unique experience in that I graduated actually in the aftermath of the .com catastrophe, or so like that downturn, and then was a nanny for 2 years in Seattle, and then went to grad school and graduated from grad school into the downturn. So there were two different experiences, right? But what happens is you internalize this idea that like, it's really, really hard to find a job. You have to settle for whatever you can get. You have to get paid very little and accept no benefits. And that stability in your job is something that is pretty much impossible to find. And what that does psychologically, it's pretty complex, right? It just, you internalize these ideas about work that stay with you for a long time, which is why I think so many millennials, when the pandemic hit, they were like, of course, right? They're like, of course, I just barely got like a modicum of stability. Of course, the crap is going to hit the fan. But I think that, you know, as you were gesturing towards, and what the book tries to do is trace that larger instability historically, right? Because it's not just somehow the Great Recession happened in 2008, a lot of people were screwed, and then a lot of the jobs that were added back into the economy were actually contingent jobs that didn't pay well and had no stability and had no benefits. It's more that this is a process that has been happening over the course of our lifetimes, started really in like the mid 70s, kind of when boomers many of whom had grown up during what is often called the golden age of American capitalism. So this post-war period around 1950 to around the oil crisis in the 1970s, they grew up with stability that lasted just long enough so that people kind of thought it would last forever. And then when they entered the job market, things started to fall apart. And boomers adopted a whole slew of strategies, for lack of a better word, to try to regain some of that stability that so many families had enjoyed entering into the middle class for the first time in the post-war period. So, some of those strategies, one that one of my personal heroes, Barbara Ehrenreich, talks about is the yuppie strategy. And anyone who was alive during that time will remember how yuppies were personified in all sorts of different ways during the 1980s. It was like one of those things, kind of like hipsters, where like no one would admit that they were a yuppie, but they all understood that yuppies were the worst. And then another thing was voting for more conservative agendas. I think that's best embodied by the shift to Reaganism and embracing the ideas of trickle-down economics, which is that if we cut taxes for the rich and if we defund or significantly just kind of get rid of a lot of federal institutions, then things will get better, right? Our economy will get back on track. And I think in practice, what happened is that unknit, disintegrated a lot of those social safety nets that created that stability for boomers in the first place, right? So, the most vivid example that I think a lot of millennials can relate to is when they say, I have so much student debt, and a boomer in their life says, well, I worked my way through college, right? And the reason why so many boomers were able to work their way through college and emerge with very little debt or none at all is because college was a lot cheaper, especially public college. And the reason for that is because people were paying a lot more taxes to fund state institutions. And so it was possible to work through college. That is no longer possible, whether that's Wazoo, UW, U of I, even where I grew up in Lewiston, like LCSC, you still have to take on some sort of debt because you're probably working a minimum wage job if you're trying to do this. So in reaction to the disintegration of so many of these social safety nets, millennials have not only taken on debt, but also taken on that generalized stress of like, I don't have anyone to catch me if I fall. I could be bankrupt and go into significant debt by a medical catastrophe if it happened next week, or by COVID, right? Like,
Yep.
I just look at these horror stories of people and the medical bills that they're paying because of COVID. I don't know if I can have kids because I just cannot figure out how I would pay for good, reliable childcare.
Yep.
There's so many things that are part of that disintegration of the social safety net.
Absolutely. I think one of the most clarifying examples for me that you gave in the book is the idea that when you used to work at GM or you used to work at, insert big company name here, everyone from the CEO to the janitor got to tap into that company's system. And that I would say, and you the stats more than me, but for the majority of jobs that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
You don't have that pension option anymore. If you have anything, it might be a 401k that maybe your employer contributes to if you're lucky.
Maybe.
You might have access to a healthcare plan now, but the reality is you're probably paying about the same as you would be on any sort of public exchange.
Right.
So it's an interesting, and I think it's interesting for millennials who haven't experienced, like I've never experienced that in any job I've gone to. I've never gone to a job and they're like, oh, here's your pension. That's a foreign concept to me. And my running joke has always been with my friends, I'll never retire. And that used to be something I would say just based on my personality. But like now it's like a real joke. It's a real.
No, I say this all the time. I'm like, oh, clearly I'm going to work until I die because this is going to be a significant problem. It's already a problem with boomers, right? Because a lot of those pensions and social safety nets were taken away over the course of the 80s. So there are a lot of boomers. I just read a piece in the New York Times about the increase in homeless boomers in the Arizona area, right? Like this is a vivid demonstration of what happens when you do not have a safety net for people in our society, is you have elders who are homeless, right?
Yep.
And I mean, the example that you bring up of the ways in which people of different educational and ostensible class levels, right? If you were working on the janitorial staff at a company, like where my granddad was an accountant, 3M in Minnesota, the janitor would have the access to that same social safety net. He wouldn't be making as much of a salary, right? But he would still have stability. And that is something that has really been evacuated from our society. And a lot of it has to do with what economist David Weil calls the fissuring of our economy. So a place like 3M, and I actually don't know if this is the case at 3M, but a place like 3M, you could even like look at a place, think about it in terms of education. So a place like Gonzaga, where maybe the janitorial staff there used to be employed by Gonzaga, now almost positively they are employed by a subcontractor. And the subcontractor is in charge of any benefits if there are any, right? So Gonzaga is able to distance themselves from any sort of responsibility with that employee. And I don't mean to like signal out Gonzaga in any way. This is an incredibly prevalent strategy. And part of it was people saying, okay, we are a company and we're trying to like get to our core efficiencies, which is consultant language. How can we farm out the things that we don't know that much about, like say janitorial services or like food services, that sort of thing, to other companies? And the effect of that, though, is that almost always the larger company is going to choose a secondary company that is the cheapest. And the cheapest often means very little security for those people who are being employed.
Yep. And I think, this might be a good segue into sort of the gig economy and how jobs that have been created in recent years aren't really jobs, or if they are jobs, they're very, very part-time and do not come with the benefits. And I think especially in journalism, there's been a real trend towards freelancing and sort of being your own writer and sort of entering the gig economy as a writer. But like a lot of my friends and myself included, when I freelanced for a little while, that is a hard place to be in. And it's interesting to sort of have a job, but not actually, having to piece together those hours, as so many people in the millennial generation do, is exhausting. See Burnout. But I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that connection of those jobs becoming I don't want to say not real jobs, but fragmented jobs, not complete jobs anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I think we could even just, in language that other older generations might understand, is they're really just part-time jobs, but they're posing as full-time jobs.
Yep.
So that's one of the difficulties of freelance, I think, is that the combination of the idea that like you constantly need to be pitching, right? Like this is significant to journalism, but there's lots of other places, whether you are like a graphic designer or whatever, like you are always putting yourself out there. So you're always looking for clientele. You're always trying to keep that clientele. And at the same time, you're trying to produce stuff. And the benefit of having full-time employment is that mental security to actually focus on something for a little bit of time. It's incredible what even a modicum of security allows in terms of creativity and productivity. Like the things that we say that we want more of in the United States, productivity, will give people security and they'll be a lot more productive. And I think freelancing is just so exhausting and a burnout recipe, in large part because you feel like every hour of your day is another hour that you could be working, is potential to be working, because you don't have any hours. Every hour is available. And that's hours that you're sleeping. That's hours that you might want to be devoting to leisure and to rest. But there's a real disincentive to actually segment off any time for anything other than work.
Definitely. I have a couple questions from viewers, but I'm trying, one I'll fit in here, and then I want to switch gears a little bit, and then I'll come back. But someone, this is a viewer named Deb. She said, did us boomer parents add to millennial outlook with the everybody gets a trophy stuff? Too much positive. And I think that kind of fits with what we were talking about, you know? I mean, those systems worked for that generation. So I think it's a natural, I find myself in this predicament sometimes where I'm like, do I blame, how much blame do you put on the people that raised you when in theory those systems were going to be there,
Right.
but they're not.
Yeah, it's complicated. You know, and there are several chapters of the book that try to zero in on the coping strategies that boomers took in order to find stability in their own lives, but also the hope is to find it for their kids, right? If you are feeling unstable in your own life and struggling to find, you know, anything, an escape from precarity, you're like, okay, maybe in my life I'll never find it, but I could find it for my kids. And oftentimes that translates into parenting strategies that can create a path towards burnout for the child. So I talk a lot about in the book the development of a parenting strategy called concerted cultivation, which was identified by a sociologist in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's hard to actually even talk about it as a parenting strategy because now it's just accepted as like good parenting. And what it is, you know, making sure your kid is very, very well-rounded and is participating in so many different activities, but also that the activities can be counted in some way. So instead of just free play, it's play dates that have a beginning and an end and a purpose and are oftentimes supervised by one or both parents. Instead of like pick up basketball, it's AAU like competitive basketball. It has to be something that you can put on as a line on a resume as evidence of fleshing yourself out as a college candidate almost always.
Yep.
And I talk about in the book that this is something that growing up in Lewiston, I didn't have a ton of because there just wasn't a lot. Like we didn't even have soccer until I was, I think, like a junior or a senior. Like I was a cheerleader because there were no other options. And and I played piano, but like never was like, I need to be amazing at piano. I just liked playing it and I quit for a while. And then I started back again because my mom was like, only if you want to do it. But I was like on math team and did some other things that I think would be considered components of concerted cultivation. I went to French camp for many summers, but then I also went to church camp at Camp Spalding, which is north of Spokane, like every summer. And there's nothing about that that's like fancy, right? Like I didn't win at church camp. But I think that the inclination towards gearing your kid towards a resume, like life as resume, really amped up over the course of millennials' lifetimes. The trophy thing I want to address because I've talked to a lot of people about this, and that actually started with Gen X, right? So older boomers are parents of Gen X, young Gen Xers. And that started like kind of the tail end of the 70s. I don't ever remember getting an award just for participating.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
Ever since I started participating and organized anything, absolutely.
That's so funny. But also, so, you know, that is oftentimes something or like an attributes that's used to denigrate millennials that like, oh, they expect a trophy for everything. And as this person who posed this question pointed out, who gave us those trophies? Like, who thought that was a good idea? It's difficult, or I think it's backwards to maybe blame millennials for that expectation if we weren't the ones that, you know,
Yeah, I
it
did not.
wasn't like 4-year-olds were like, where is my participation ribbon?
So many trophies. It's a little absurd. I truly think they're all in a box in my parents' garage right now. So I wanted to talk about disparities, and in two ways. One in class and the other in race. Whichever one you want to talk about first, I'm open to. But I think I guess we'll just since I'm still talking, I guess I'll just direct it. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
I thought I was going to ask a question. You actually talked to one of my former coworkers. Her name's Co Bragg. She works for the 19th now.
Yeah.
She and I worked together in Jackson, Mississippi a few years ago. And she talked to you a little bit about, you know, the idea that people of color, and particularly Black Americans, have been experiencing burnout in this country for way longer than, you know, white people. And I'm interested if you think that part of the reason why it's taken so long to sort of get to the point where we're talking about it, you're able to pitch a book, write a viral essay about it. Has this finally become a thing because it's affecting middle-class white people, and were we just not listening previously? You know,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if
No, yes, for sure. Absolutely, right? Like burnout, if a burnout is a symptom of precarity, as we said before, then people who are experiencing systemic discrimination for generations, and, you know, systemic racism that makes it much more difficult to own property, to accumulate wealth, to find secure employment, to, once you find that secure employment, just to like deal with people's freaking microaggressions all the time. Like all of that those are all components of burnout. And I think that what happened, and you can think, you can kind of try to figure out how you want to think about this, but like with millennials, that precarity really shifted wholesale over into middle-class white people, right? Like we became part of that larger chunk.
Mhm.
And that shifted the experience into the majority. So it was no longer a minority experience, it was a majority experience. And that made it worth thinking about. So yes, a huge part of that is that white bourgeois people who had been insulated from it in vast numbers were now experiencing what had been a baseline condition for people of color in our country for a very long time. I think that absolutely we should have been paying attention to it long before, right? Because our society is only as healthy as the most sick amongst us, and only as burnt out as the most burnt out amongst us, right? And I think that a lot of my thinking and research has been like expanding and thinking about the ways in which, like, how can we start to actually treat problems that are not necessarily felt by the majority seriously before they become the majority, right?
Right. Well, and my question for you was, and I know you don't propose solutions at the end of your book, which I think is interesting, and we'll get to that because I think that's interesting. But I'm curious what you think that means, you know, with what we know about how you and I are not even close to experts in burnout.
Right.
And so what does that mean for the movement of breaking down these systems going forward? And, you know, and I immediately think of the feminist movement when I'm talking about this, right? Like ways in which like movements in the past have left crucial people out of the conversation, or rather just should have stepped back and let others lead. How do we get it right this time, I guess is what I'm asking. And I'm not asking you to have all the answers, but if you have ideas or things from your research,
this is such a good point. I think that you know, this is in some ways like the argument that's around Bernie and socialism and Marxism, to say a dirty word, but is that if you just try to think of this as an economic problem first, does that actually solve these intersecting and amplifying problems that have to do with race and gender and you know, cisgenderedness and like sexual orientation, all of the different components of identity that I think build on the experience of burnout. And, you know, I think that like my solution, similar to how I think of my goals for my feminism, is that it has to be intersectional, right? So it has to, like, what can providing universal childcare do? It can lift all boats in a lot of ways, right? It can help so many different mothers. And if in many ways it will help, I think, mothers who are single, mothers who are experiencing so many of the difficulties of burnout in a way that is
unknown to a lot of people who are partnered and who are white and who are middle class. But at the same time, like, how can we prevent this from just like, oh, if we raise all boats, then we raise all boats at our current level?
Yeah,
So
where's
there
the
are
equity?
still these systemic
Equity.
inequalities, right?
Mhm.
And I don't have clear answers to that, except for the people who are making these policies need to represent the people who are having these problems. So,
Right.
like the people at the table, to use the cliche, you need it. Like, it's not just that you have to have women at the table, like you have to have working single mothers at the table. You have to have indigenous women and Black women and queer women and trans women, like all sorts of different types of people who are making these policies moving forward.
Definitely. Did you find that when you were interviewing people, and a great part of Anne's book for people listening is she interviewed a ton of people. How many people did you interview, by the way?
Well, so I did Google like Google Forms where I was just like, tell me about everything that's to do with your burnout. It like focused on different chapters. So like the leisure chapter, the growing up chapter, those sorts of things. And millennials, I think, are very we're so busy that we don't like want to make an appointment to talk on the phone about something. But if you give us like a blank form where we can talk about a lot of things
Mhm.
and do it, while we're avoiding other work, then we sometimes will be more willing to write those sorts of things. So I heard from 10,000 people over the course of all of my different calls for responses. And I read all of them and really tried to pinpoint both things that I heard a lot, right? So again and again and again, things that came up, and then things that were pointing to the corners of what burnout would feel like in different experiences. But I would follow up with people if I had more questions and wanted to flesh out their experience more. But it was just a real privilege to be able to expand my understanding in that way.
Yeah, that's amazing. Um, Continuing on with the disparities and talking about disparities, I have a good question from Sabra. Sorry if I said your name wrong, Sabra. She said, she or he said, in 2004, I was a homeless teenager. Several friends got jobs as human Wi-Fi signals, wandering the city, prompted to go where Wi-Fi was needed most at various times of day. In your research and interviews, how did you see homelessness and workaholism and society as helicopter parent play into college student loan decisions for formerly homeless millennials?
Mhm. I talked to some people who uh, were formerly homeless, who or experiencing homelessness, which is the language that I try to use, and who didn't really talk a ton about that experience so much as like how like being experiencing homelessness conditioned them again to be like everything could fall apart at any moment.
Right.
So it was again an amplifying experience on their burnout, and just you know some people might say it's actually a good strategy that like, oh, you should be ready for your life to implode at any moment. But to me, that is a symptom of a society that is in decline.
Yeah, not the best way to live. Well, and I think, if you can talk a little bit about what I feel like I've experienced a lot of since I've entered the workforce, but the idea of the disappearing middle class, I was
Mhm.
really surprised how many people that responded to you that ended up in your book identified as middle class. And I don't know if that understanding has shifted. And I think if you got the sense that it shifted, that would be good for people to understand
Right.
as they're reading. Because, I think I just go back to the example of it used to be when you had a job and you just got healthcare, you weren't paying upwards of $200, $300, $4,000, however many dollars a month into that healthcare plan. You used to just sort of get it. It was a part of being an employee.
Right.
And I think, that middle class sentiment or sort of losing that middle class status right now is being felt not just by millennials, but also by, like what we were talking about a little bit earlier, by boomers that are running out of money.
Yep.
And so if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I'm reading this incredible book right now that's called White Collar. It was written in 1951, and it was about essentially like the rise of office workers over the course of the 20th century. I mean, he's writing again in 1951. He's a sociologist, but thinking about how people began, it said if you were not an hourly worker and if you worked in an office, if you were on salary, that made people consider themselves of part of this middle class. And this was different than the previous middle class, which was largely people who had like started their own business. But so office workers just generally became this huge part post-war of the middle class. And it was during that post-war period that the workforce actually shifted from people who were doing hourly work or who were working on the farm, you know, their own farm that they either owned or that they labored on, into this salaried form. And I think what has happened since the post-war period is that a lot of those jobs and a lot of that conception of middle classness has eroded. So people have technically dropped out of the middle class, but they still consider themselves part of the middle class, right?
Fascinating.
And this keys into the overarching idea that is always true of Americans, is that like if you like, they've done all these surveys that show like Americans are more likely, whether they're actually upper class or lower class, they are far more likely to group themselves as part of this blob of the middle class, whereas like British people are much more, I don't know what, like for lack of a better word, honest about where their class actually is. And so much of this, I think, has to do with the idea that to be a good American in some way, like successful American, is to be middle class. And also that in that post-war period, so many people, especially white people, joined the middle class. And then even as their children have taken slight and then larger steps back, you still identify yourself and your family as a middle class family. Like millennials are the first generation since the post-war period to take a step back from their parents in terms of wealth accumulation, savings, all like family, all these sorts of things. But no one's like, oh, I'm no longer middle class. And people are taking out so much more debt in order to sustain the consumer patterns of being a middle class person. So debt to put your kids in school or to give them the things that they need in order to display as a certain class at school, but also debt to pay for however many cars you want, debt to pay for vacations, debt for, you know, redoing your house, and that adds on top of student debt. So like the tremendous amount of consumer debt that people are accumulating in order to keep up appearances as middle class belies how many people have actually fallen out of the middle class.
That's so interesting.
It's
Well, and
so
so many of
interesting.
these things, some of these things are to me like just like outcomes of burnout, right? Like they're just like a natural trajectory of like, well, yes, like yes, I'm not looking at houses because I can barely afford rent and I'm still paying debt. Like that is like a natural sort of like some of the natural outcomes of what millennials have experienced are still being questioned by older generations sometimes. And I'm like, no, but it makes sense.
Well, you know, and like the one that used to be super popular a couple years ago was like, oh, these millennials, they complain about their student debt, but they're buying avocado toast, right? Like people spend money on things that are signifiers of class status in some capacities. So yeah, a millennial might have $100,000 in debt, but if they are trying to be part of the cultural middle class, like if they live in a city and are trying to hang out with their friends to show that they are part of this like white collar establishment, then yeah, you buy that avocado toast and you go to brunch. And I think it's really, you get into this really dicey situation when you start judging people's spending habits in accordance to what you think they should be spending money on. Like this is always the thing that happened all the time in Lewiston was people like, oh, those people are living in a trailer, but they have a big truck. I'm like, who cares? Like if they like their big truck and they don't care as much about their trailer, like it's such a bourgeois idea that you should only spend money on your house and that like other things don't matter.
Right. Well, and it also just sort of ignores how American culture works. Like we're very much so, you know, if you've spent any time in other countries, we're a very materialistic culture.
Yeah. Well, and part of that is just that compunction that in order to be middle class, you need to be buying things all the time.
Right. Keep that economy going.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic and sort of what it hit. My understanding is it hit right when you were finishing this book. And
Yes.
so, you made the choice not to go back and inject it into the chapters, which I think honestly doesn't, like, reading it in the midst of a pandemic, I was like, oh no, this all checks out. This passes the smell test. But I'm curious, since, publishing this in the midst of a pandemic, sort of what for you has sort of reoccurred to you in your research or come back up for you and been like, wow, like that actually is a way more, like, whether that be a bigger disparity or like a bigger deal than you thought, or just sort of this pandemic, at least in my reporting, has sort of illuminated everything that was underneath and was already there. And oftentimes it's disparities, racially more than anything, and just sort of social determinants of health all over the place on my beat. So I'm curious for you in your research, if while you're wrapping up the book and now just living life in the pandemic, if you've been like, wow, like this type of research hits different, or like this makes a lot more sense now. What are some things?
Everything is just amplified, everything, right? Like it just like ratcheted up everything. And I think, as you said, like it's just been incredibly clarifying. All of the things that were true are just more true, but also more visible. And I think that that is actually very useful in terms of people acknowledging that there's a problem. Right? So before, oftentimes I think millennials would have to kind of convince other people in their life. They're like, no, this is a problem. Like we're struggling. and other people would be like, no, the economy's great. You're like, no, not for me. But I think that there is just no denying what's in front of our faces, right?
Yeah.
And the big thing that's happened, I think, for people who were in jobs where they haven't been able to go back to work, right? Like that, the precarity of that situation is all the more abundant. The fact that it's so incredibly labyrinthian to access unemployment insurance in so many states, like, yep, that's broken. The fact that we still have not figured out another recovery or relief program since the last one ran out, also a huge problem. The fact that we haven't figured out how to protect people from evictions, huge problem. The only thing that is actually that I would credit the federal government with is that they have sustained the pause on student loans for federally subsidized loans, right? So anything that is a public loan. People who are private loans, screwed, right? Because even if you go on forbearance, you are still collecting interest. You are totally screwed. But people on public loans, including myself, have had their loans paused and are not accruing interest in any way. And then the other huge thing is that I think people who are working from home right now are like, this is unsustainable. I just work all the time. And if I don't work all the time, like I don't have any other personality. Like what else is there?
Right.
And then the last thing, and we haven't talked about this much, but all of the parenting burnout that existed before the pandemic is just like expanded infinite, like so massively.
Yes. And I think the other thing that also for me reading this book really amplified the idea that, again, and we talked about a little bit earlier, but a lot of the gig economy workers are considered essential now.
Yeah.
Like a lot of millennials and even even Gen Zers at this point who are working part-time at a sub shop, working part-time at a grocery store. I mean, they're essential, and they are put at higher risk by the nature of them doing that work. And many, if not all of those jobs, not all, but the majority of those jobs do not offer health insurance in the midst of a pandemic. And that's something as a healthcare reporter that I think about all the time, is sort of, that we just sort of lifted the lid off of the most vulnerable workers in our economy. And we said, okay, you have to serve us though. Good luck with that mask.
Yeah, well, and I think about the people who were laid off of jobs for whatever reason and who then found work working for like grocery delivery programs, right?
Mhm.
And that's a job that pre-pandemic, you might have like some repetitive stress injuries or something like that, but was not a physically precarious job. So now it's not only precarious in terms of your financials, but it's also a job that is putting you at risk all the time. And that's, yeah, for a lot of people, those are the only jobs that you can find, are jobs that are putting you in the front line.
Right. Right. One of our viewers asked this question. I'm curious how you answer this question after reading the book. I'm not sure. Are there certain sectors of the economy that have been good to millennials and particular sectors that have been the worst offenders?
Wow. I would say that I wouldn't delineate it by sectors. I would say that the places that have have proven to be refuges, for lack of a better word, for millennials, are places that are unionized. So in states where nurses and teachers are unionized, they have a lot more protections. In states where graduate students are unionized, a lot more protections and a lot more of a living wage and affordable health care, cost of living raises, basic stuff. If you live in a state that is right to work, it is a lot more difficult to access those things. And I think that some people might be like, oh, well, tech is a great place for millennials. And I think that tech has been a place where millennials either burn out so brightly. Like, you might have financial stability, but you are a shell of yourself because of this fetishization of productivity and overwork.
You just described my high school best friend. Shout out to Maddie. I'm giving her your book. Don't worry.
Or you're still a contingent worker, right? So like the wages of disrupting different industries is the freelancification, the contingent workerification of a lot of these different industries. So like being a cabbie used to be actually a pretty steady job, say in New York. And that industry has been completely undercut, right? And also even in places like Amazon or Google, there are huge percentages of the workforce, and sometimes more than half of the people who quote unquote work for these companies are actually contractors, right? They're permalancers. They're people who might be getting paid a good amount of money, but have no stability, and also whose healthcare is not as good as the people that they are oftentimes working right beside. So I think that there's problems all along. And my advice to people is like, find a state and find a place where you can have union protections and start thinking about how you can start organizing your own workplace.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's so interesting. The Idaho-Washington state line is a fascinating place to start. But, even when I was working and reporting in Mississippi, a right-to-work state, at one point, Bernie Sanders came down to try to unionize auto workers down there, and it failed.
Yeah.
The vote failed. And I think it's interesting how our country, as wide and diverse as the United States, has sort of developed these almost like little experiments in different states, depending on where you live. You might have a very union-friendly state, or you might have a no unions are allowed here state. And someone doing the same job in Idaho and in Washington might have a completely different experience, life, place on the social and class spectrum.
Which, like there is a reason why Idaho really struggles to recruit teachers, right? And it's because they are some of the lowest paid in the nation. And because in a lot of places, they can go right over the border and work somewhere else. There is an incredible, the ability of Idaho to recruit and sustain teachers is just so poor. And especially in places along the border here, right? Like people that I knew in Lewiston, they're like, why am I still teaching in Lewiston? I could go to Clarkston, I could go to Pullman, like Pullman's a half an hour drive away. Like, why would I tolerate no cost of living increases? Why would I tolerate the complete devaluation of my vocation by this state? I have strong feelings. My mom is a teacher, about the way that Idaho thinks about education. So you can see those coming through. But I do think that part of the thing with unions, it's kind of like voting, right? Like you need to have a tradition of honoring and thinking about unions as valuable. And one of the problems I think with unions in America right now is that they became powerful enough and routine enough, I guess, that like people started to take them for granted and thought they were the problem, right? And in some cases, unions can absolutely overstep their bounds of power. But when that happens, then you have things like right to work legislation that disempowers or defangs or eliminates unions in some capacity, or makes it so that if you try to join a union, you can be penalized. And then sometimes you just have people who are like, we don't want a union. Why would we want to do that? We're happy. And so it's hard to organize during times of relative stability. Or for millennials, when you're like, well, I just got to take what I can get. I can't ask for anything more.
Yep.
And the same book that I was referencing earlier that was written in 1951, he talked about why it's so hard for white collar workplaces to unionize. And so much of it has to do with workers who are like, oh, well, I could still be the boss. So it's really hard to create solidarity when you still think that like, oh, I could have a slightly higher distinction. I could be promoted in some slight way.
That's so, it's almost like that. It's like that American dream sort of bootstraps independent strain of thought, like persists just enough
right
to like keep you going.
Right.
And there is a question about the American dream that I want you to answer
Yes.
as well. And then there's one more like big take home point that I want to talk about, and then I'll let you go maybe.
Okay.
This is from Michael. He says, did you find millennials carry shame because the American dream is hard to conceptualize when you and your partner are living in your parents' basement, for example? Which, by the way, I've totally lived in my parents' basement, and it is a privilege if you have parents that have a basement for you to crash on.
Exactly. Well, and this is the other thing too, when people are like, after the Great Recession, they were like, oh, these millennials who want to move back to their parents' bedrooms. It's like, first of all, there's no jobs. What else am I going to do? I have like student debt coming to bear. What else am I going to do? But also that fails to account for the number of millennials whose parents got, evicted or foreclosed upon. Like, it is an incredible privilege to be able to live in your parents' bedroom. I think that it depends. I think a lot of millennials, and I think the pandemic has solidified this, have moved from shame to rage.
Yeah.
Like, we are angry. And a lot of millennials who are in their 30s who thought, oh, well, I thought I would reach some point of stability at this point in my life. I thought that I would be able to feel stable enough to have a family. I thought that I would find balance in some capacity, are looking up maybe in the pause or the franticness that is created by the pandemic and saying, this is BS. And that is my hope with the book, is that a lot of us in the millennial generation, but also other generations, can be like, it doesn't have to be this way, right? We can change things, but we have to see that it's a problem first.
Definitely. And I think the hidden nugget, if I can just ruin it sort of for people, is that ultimately, like at the core of like what not just millennials, but I think the average person wants is to be valued.
Yeah.
And your book does a beautiful job of showing how capitalism and the systems that used to be in place that have disintegrated have completely made us not valued as humans anymore in the workplace, in society, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about like that part of that rage, I think, is, and again, this is just personal experience, in reporting, talking to friends, people are mad because they are not valued. Yeah. And people are mad because they want to be in a system that values them a little bit, whether that be paying them what they're worth, whether that be enabling them to go see a doctor sometimes, whether that be enabling a single mom to have childcare so that she can actually work at a job she wants to and not work 3 part-time jobs, you know? And so my question for you is sort of, how do you connect that like idea that every person is valuable and we want to live in a system that values every person, how do you connect that with sort of, you know, take homes? And I know your book doesn't propose solutions, but it hints at things like policies, like voting, like, you know, even just having conversations with people like this and about this. You know, but if you can talk a little bit about value and sort of what's next, what do we do with that rage, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that idea of value, it fits in with something that I think a lot of older politicians bring up, which is the dignity of work. Uh, and when you are dignified in your work, or when someone treats you with dignity, they are saying to you, you are valuable. You are not disposable. You are not a robot. We don't want to break your body and we don't want to break your spirit. And like, you matter because you are a person. And that is what has been evacuated from so many workplaces, right? Because like,
Right.
even just the idea that people aren't employees, they're independent contractors, like that underlines the relationship between the person and the company that they are making money for. Independent, right? On their own, without a safety net. And I think that one thing that millennials are waking up to, and I hope other people outside of our generation are waking up to as well, is that idea that like, we matter just because we're people. It doesn't matter where we grew up. It doesn't matter what our job is, how much education we have, what race we are, what language we speak at home. Like, all of these things, it just doesn't matter. We should be treated as humans who deserve just a slight amount of stability, right? A life free of fear.
Right. Well, and want to live in a system and a government that, live in a country and a system and in a government that encourages that.
Right.
And again, you don't have to, the government doesn't have to like give me a high five, but just like show me you care a little.
Right. Like, don't make my life so hard all the time. Don't make healthcare so hard. Don't make voting so hard. Don't make protecting myself from a pandemic so hard that like, it feels like a battle every day just to find groceries or to go out into a public space. Like, that's why, again, it doesn't, like, the pandemic did not have to come out this way, and our society does not have to be this way. And there is proof both in our recent history and across the globe that that is the case. And so I want people to like hold on to that anchor, but also hope for a different way.
Definitely. I think that's the perfect note to end on. And if you would like to learn more, her book is available for purchase at your local bookstore here in Spokane.
And aunties, go to aunties.
Yeah.
Sorry, we say aunties in Lewiston because we're not sophisticated. So
I'm sure I just say that because it sounds fancy. Anyways, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope people understand millennials slightly better now.
Nice Spokane.
Good night.